Good evening. My name is Alex Burden. I'm the Executive Director of the Truman Library Institute, the nonprofit partner of the Harry S. Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. I'm really happy to be with you tonight and excited about the program we have in front of us. It's great to see so many of you once again joining us for one of our webinar events. We had 844 registrants from 42 states and 8 different countries sign up for tonight's program. I'll be interested to see what the total tally is. It looks like we're approaching 400 right now. It's another great turnout for what should be a fascinating conversation. I appreciate you joining us tonight as the Truman Library Institute continues to observe the 75th anniversary of important moments from Mr. Truman's presidency. Tonight, we are excited to share the fascinating story of an occasion when world leaders, global politics, and the Cold War descended on a small town in central Missouri. And we are fortunate and grateful to have 3 luminaries from Kansas City, David Von Drehle, Candice, Millard, and Crosby, Kemper, with us this evening to explore Winston Churchill's visit to Missouri and his famous Iron Curtain speech. I'd like to take a moment to thank the 46 individuals that provided contributions to the Institute as you registered for tonight's program. This unsolicited support totaled $1,600, which will be used to underwrite programs like these that we continue to offer free of charge to our community, which clearly now is a national community in scope. This support is very much appreciated. Speaking of fundraising and our gratitude, the Truman campaign continues to surpass goals and break records, but we still need more help in order to fully fund several priority capital projects like the Truman Oval Office restoration and the renovation of the auditorium, as well as a series of wonderful 75th anniversary events and commemorative programs we have planned. The main focus of this campaign is the renovation of the Truman Library and the installation of a new exhibit, which is in its final phases and is simply fantastic. And I can't wait to hear your reactions once you've had a chance to experience it. The project is currently focused on installing the beautiful and engaging new exhibits and assembling and activating the multimedia components. Later this month, the final and perhaps most important stage of the project begins. The placement of the documents and artifacts from the Truman collection in their display cases in their new permanent homes. We are so close to being done, close enough, in fact, that we plan to begin providing tours to our campaign donors and VIPs in the near future and hope to open in the early summer. We will keep you updated as our reentry and reopening plans develop. In the meantime, if you'd like more information about the project or how to get involved with the campaign, please visit the Capital Campaign section of our website, trumanlibraryinstitute.org, or call me or send me an email. That's it for the sales pitch. Thanks for your patience. I'd like to thank Crosby, Kemper, Candice, and David for accepting our invitation to participate in tonight's event. And I'd like to introduce David, who will moderate tonight's program. Thank you again for being with us. I hope you enjoy tonight's presentation. David, take it away.
Thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here again with our virtual audience, and I hope that soon we'll be together again in person. I'm David Von Drehle. I am a columnist for the Washington Post and a member of the board of directors of the Truman Library Institute. We're the private nonprofit foundation established to support the mission and legacy of the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum. Tonight is yet another, as Alex said, in a series of programs that we have been doing for a year now and will continue to do for the next 7 years, commemorating the 75th anniversary of the literally world-changing decisions and crises faced by our 33rd president, the man from Missouri, Harry S. Truman. Last month, we had a program commemorating the long telegram that Foreign Service officer in Moscow, George Kennan, sent to the State Department, making the case for a containment policy against our former World War II allies in the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin. This view that the alliance that had won the war in Europe and against Japan was not necessarily going to be sustainable as an entirely friendly relationship post-war, had been growing from really the moment that Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin got together at Yalta to discuss the post-war world. But this is the period 75 years ago when what would become the Cold War policy, foreign policy of the West, really began to take shape. And as you'll hear tonight with our panelists, it was like so many moments in that World War II period. It was the rhetorical genius of Winston Churchill that really crystallized the idea and the reality for the Western world. Churchill's speech, as we'll hear, was not immediately popular, either in the US or in Western Europe. And yet the force of his analysis and the magic of his words, of his rhetoric, once again carried the day. I grew up, like many of you, hearing the words Iron Curtain all the time as an ordinary matter of conversation. It was on the evening news, it was in our classrooms, and it was in casual conversation. But it was Winston Churchill in the little town of Fulton, Missouri in March 1946 who created that image with his famous line, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent of Europe." Talking with us tonight is two panelists who will be well known to our Kansas City audience. The first is Crosby Kemper. Many of you know Crosby as the former executive director of the Kansas City Public Library. He's now the director of the Institute for Museum and Library Services of the federal government. Crosby is, as everyone knows, one of the world's great readers and polymaths. And among the subjects that he's mastered is this story of Winston Churchill's trip with Harry Truman to Missouri in 1946. We also have with us the incomparable writer of popular history, one of the great story finders and storytellers of her generation, Candice Millard, whose books have taken us into the lives of Theodore Roosevelt, of James Garfield, and yes, of Winston Churchill. So without much more from me, I'd like to start with Crosby and ask, set the stage for us, paint the picture. How did it happen that Churchill came to Missouri, and what was the scene? What was that day like?
So you have to start off by asking yourself, there are actually so many reasons this shouldn't have happened. I mean, small town in Missouri, Fulton, small college, Westminster, which was failing at the time. There were only 200 students because of the draft in World War II, and Churchill had just been defeated a few months earlier while he was meeting Harry Truman for the first time at Potsdam. The British held an election and an overwhelming vote against him, though he remained the leader of the opposition. But Bullitt McClure, the president of Westminster College, decides, after talking to some friends, to send an invitation to Churchill to see if he would come. And they had the bright idea of getting Harry Vaughan, graduate of the college, and military aide to President Truman, and most importantly, his close friend from World War I days, to present it to the president. And Truman wrote a note on the invitation and sent it off to Churchill, who received it at a time in November of 45 when he was very concerned and beginning to speak both in Parliament and a speech he gave to the Belgian Parliament about just what you talked about, the Iron Curtain dropping on Eastern Europe, and also particularly at this time, the beginning of Russian attempts to force themselves on the Iranians, the Persians, the Turks, get a warm water port and that sort of thing. Then there's the question of why Churchill would come. Well, he is out of office, but he was still a heroic figure in most of Western Europe. He was called the savior of civilization by the Belgian prime minister when he spoke to Belgium. And he and Truman had bonded to some small extent, at least, at Potsdam. They saw the world in the same way. They had a shared worldview, I think. It was a heroic view, and it was a view that was increasingly viewed as a defense of civilization under attack from the Soviet Union. And so he felt he would have an influence on Truman if he came. Also, there was a $3.5 billion loan that the British were trying to get out of Congress. He thought he might have an effect on that. And he thought this would be an opportunity to do that, which it turned out to be. And of course, the part of the scene that's remarkable about this is riding with Truman and Clark Clifford and Admiral Leahy and others on the Ferdinand Magellan, the train that goes from Washington to St. Louis, and they take another train to Fulton. 24 hours of whiskey, cigars, and poker, which Churchill had never played. And Churchill claimed that he deliberately lost to Truman in order to get the loan, of course. But evidence from others on the train is that he really didn't know how to play poker. And Truman absolutely did know how to play poker. And so they arrive, and then the other question that you need to, as you set the scene for this, to know is that, as you said, this was controversial after he gave the speech. There were a lot of people who felt that the Soviet Union were the forces of progress, and so there was controversy afterwards. And Truman was in the process of achieving the same worldview as Churchill, but he hadn't quite got there yet. So he didn't know exactly how he should respond. So he claimed that he hadn't read the speech when he in fact had read the speech on the train, and very carefully, and had announced to Churchill his support for the speech. It's the beginning of a slow but sure. You mentioned Kennan's telegram. Kennan's telegram, Burns who's the Secretary of State, is changing his view. But you have to remember, on the day that he gave the speech, there were Soviet tanks 20 miles away from Tehran. And Stalin was making these demands. So it came at a very important moment. And then maybe just to set the scene a little bit more, he gives a speech in this very small gymnasium at Westminster College after a lunch in which he gets a Missouri ham, of course, a Callaway County ham. And there's a certain folksiness to the whole atmosphere. And indeed, when he served the ham, Churchill says to Mrs. McClure, the wife of the president, he says, "The pig has reached its highest stage of evolution in this ham." And they're off to give the speech. He also got a little bottle of whiskey that was snuck into the McClure house as well. You need to know that. And they sneak off to the gymnasium to give the speech. So that's the background.
He had evidently said on the train ride over on the Ferdinand Magellan, the presidential train car, that he loved America. He just had one concern, which was that Americans stop drinking to eat dinner. Candice, you in the Hero of the Empire, you give us an absolutely indelible portrait of Winston Churchill at the other end of his life, at the beginning of his really unparalleled career. I wonder if you could just give us some background of this man who made the trip, and particularly touch on, this wasn't his first visit to the United States or even to the interior of the United States. He had a lifelong connection to this country.
He did. His mother was American, and she was a famous beauty and quite a handful, as everybody knew. But he loved her deeply, and I've always felt like there's a lot of his personality that seems very American. He's obviously sort of iconic British. Was born into a very famous, very aristocratic British family. But I think that, you know, his energy, his determination, sometimes maybe his arrogance seems particularly American. And he was very proud of his American connection and his American heritage. But I think what weighed most heavily on him, and that he felt throughout his life and kind of propelled him throughout his life, was his British legacy. You know, he was born into this very famous family. He was a direct descendant of the first Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill, who's considered to be one of the greatest generals in British history. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the leader of the House of Commons. And he was literally born at Blenheim Palace, you know, this enormous, lavish estate that was given to John Churchill from Queen Anne. And he was very proud of this legacy. And as I said, he felt it very strongly. But that said, it's not as though he was born into great wealth. You know, he didn't inherit this estate, which was a burden to the people who did. And his father had left him very little money when he had died, when Churchill was just 20 years old. And his mother had lived very grandly and had spent most of it. So he supported himself by writing. He was just an incredibly gifted and prolific writer. Mostly he was a journalist, but as we know, he wrote dozens of books, won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And he was also, so this is a theme throughout his life, was writing and history and learning, but also war. You know, he was obsessed with war from his earliest days. He collected hundreds of toy soldiers. He didn't go to college. He went to Sandhurst Royal Military Academy, and he was just always fascinated by war and admitted to feeling thrilled by it. On the other hand, he did understand firsthand the horrors of it. I think that, you know, a lot of people, when they think of Winston Churchill, they think of him as an old man sending young men to their death in World War II. But he understood as well as anyone, probably better than many, just how horrible war can be. He said you cannot gild it. By the time he was 24 years old, he had already been in 4 different wars on 3 different continents. He had nearly been killed himself many times. One time he was standing next to a horse that was shot and killed. He had the feather off of his hat shot off his head. He had killed men himself. He had watched his friends not just killed, but sliced to ribbons. So he understood the horrors of war, and he understood the immense burden it meant to engage in a war. But he also understood that sometimes you don't have a choice. Sometimes it's not about excitement, it's not about power, it's about standing up for what's right.
I appreciate that you mentioned Churchill, the writer, because we have in both of our panelists such devoted lovers of the written word. Crosby, it's my theory that part of the reason that Truman had such respect for Churchill was that Truman was a great reader, and particularly reader of history. And he must have respected that aspect, not just the leadership strength of Churchill, but the depth of historical knowledge that went into Churchill's analysis of world events.
Well, I think that's exactly right, David. And Truman was a great reader of biography. His favorite book as a child was a 4-volume thing called Great Men and Famous Women. Note the adjectives there. I think he grew up a little bit from that, though he and Churchill probably shared a somewhat, how should we say, traditional view of the roles of men and women. But the heroic side of history was something that they both cared a lot about. And Truman's view of history, which was very deep. I mean, he read a lot. Was very close to Churchill's, and that notion which the speech is partly about, of the English-speaking peoples, and this is sometimes seen as a racial thing, but I think it wasn't a racial thing at all. It was about the development of democracy, the development of the rule of law. That plays a major role in the speech. The historic moments in the development of the rule of law, from the Magna Carta to the Petition of Right to the Bill of Rights and the Declaration. And that was also Truman's view of history, sort of a Whig view of history, but with much more depth than the average view of history. So they certainly shared that.
Truman in this phase was not necessarily the decisive figure that we come to think of. The buck stops here, the guy willing to make the hard calls. In that period between the surrender of Japan and all through 1946, his reputation was for indecision and for the inability to. A lot of people felt that he didn't have the depth to take on this American role of the new superpower of the West, which was this role was very much passing from Great Britain to the United States in this period, and represented by Churchill and Truman. What was Churchill's view of Truman? What do we know about that? How much was he on a mission to put some steel in the president's spine?
So I think that's a very good point. I think that was indeed his intention. I think he didn't, because and it wasn't just Truman, it was Burns. In fact, Burns is perhaps the most significant figure in that vacillation up. Jimmy Burns, Secretary of State, former Speaker of the House, a very political politician from South Carolina, but he had Truman's ear, and he was a deal maker, and Truman inherited a little bit of Roosevelt's view of Stalin, that he was a guy you could make a deal with, and Burns felt that everybody was a guy you could make a deal with, and they went through 1945. Essentially, with foreign minister conferences and complaining about, but trying to understand Stalin's view of Yalta, the Yalta agreements, which he essentially was violating right and left, and they were trying to bring him back into the Grand Alliance of the British, the Americans, and the Soviets, and it failed. Now, I think by January, there's a supposed meeting that Truman had with Burns in January, in which Truman claimed that he read the riot act to Burns about Stalin, and the Soviets. Burns claimed it never happened, and they were the only two in the room, so we'll never know for sure. But there is a change in January, and the Kennan telegram happens, and the Soviet, the slicing and dicing of Eastern Europe, and the attack on Iran, and the attempt to change the borders with Turkey becomes so explicit that at that moment it's clearly there is a turning. But we don't know, because Truman didn't make a lot of statements in public at that point. Churchill would have assumed that there still had to be some arm wrestling. There still had to be some guidance given by, the Greeks to the Romans, if you will, the British to the Americans. And I think that is very much what the speech is all about. But it's also why he made absolutely sure that Truman saw it in advance, and was a little startled when Truman claimed he hadn't seen it.
Candice, the title of your Churchill book, Hero of the Empire, gets right to the point that for Churchill, the British Empire was a defining fact of his life and his character. And yet, so to what extent do you think he appreciated that in saving Great Britain, that the empire had been lost, and that I wonder if it was transactional, that stiffening the spine of the United States was a way of continuing to preserve an important British role in the world, even as this great, or this awesome colonial power was slipping away.
Yeah, I mean, he was an unapologetic imperialist. He felt that every part of the world would be better off being British, and he took great pride in what he felt like was bringing, civilization to any area that they colonized. And he felt that it was his job, his role in life, his responsibility to try to protect what he had been born into, and which he thought was a force for good in the world. But he certainly did see what was happening. Again, this is a man who was an extraordinary student of history, and he understood what had happened to previous empires. And he was a student of the world. He had been everywhere in the world, not everywhere, but had traveled quite a bit, and was just a really intelligent guy and could see the writing on the wall. But at the same time, I think that he understood that what was most important was trying to protect those values. And he, of course, absolutely saw the danger in Hitler before many people did. He was obviously, one of the strongest opponents of appeasement with Hitler. And he also saw the danger with Stalin. As you said, he, wanted to keep him in the alliance, but he respected him. I think he and Stalin respected each other, respected each other's courage, respected each other's intelligence, but they both were always wary of one another. And I think that he felt like he and Truman shared the same values, and needed to, be even closer than they had been, the United States and Britain, even closer than they had been, if possible, during the war. And it was a matter of protecting values and keeping a clear eye on what they were facing.
Crosby, take us through, what exactly was Churchill proposing in the speech? It's about an hour-long speech, if I remember. The one line that is immortal took a few seconds for him to utter. But it wasn't just a pep talk. He had basically a proposal or a framework that he was laying out and test driving, right? In
essence, what he was proposing was a continuation of 2/3 of the wartime alliance, the Americans and the British, and the shared values of the English-speaking people. And of course, he was including the British Commonwealth, so he's including the Australians and the New Zealanders, and at that point, maybe even the South Africans, and certainly the Canadians. He'd been talking to the Prime Minister of Canada, Mackenzie King, in the run-up to this speech. His view, I think, was less about a formal alliance than it was about the statement of shared values, shared ideals. It's why in the speech things like Magna Carta play such a role, and he connects them to the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. So his goal out of this is to get an explicit agreement that there are shared values that are worth defending. They're civilizational values. They're not just the values of the English-speaking peoples, but the English-speaking peoples have represented them and have fought for them together in World War II, and should be prepared for war in order to get peace. This is a continued theme of his from the Arms and the Covenant speeches of the 30s, where he says we must arm in order to prevent war, and essentially he's saying the same thing again. We must make a statement of our values and a willingness to defend what he calls the humble cottages against the police states. So it's not an ideal of a formal alliance. He was accused of that. It's one of the negative reactions he got, both from many Americans, both America Firsters on the right and Henry Wallace type progressives on the left, and also from about 90 Labour members of Parliament in England, is they thought he was proposing a formal alliance, which wasn't what he was doing. It really, more than anything else, it was about delineating shared values that we must be willing to defend.
He identifies in his speech, and it was mentioned earlier, that he really became prime minister in 1940 out of the crisis of Neville Chamberlain's misreading, if you will, of Hitler and Hitler's intentions. Part of what he was saying, is it fair to say, and would you agree, was that even though they had been obviously on opposite sides of the war, that Stalin had some of the same traits of Hitler, namely, he was a tyrant. There was this idea of tyranny, totalitarianism, that Churchill was trying to define as the real enemy, whether it was a tyranny or totalitarianism of the left or of the right.
Yeah, exactly right. He has a phrase, "war and tyranny," in the speech, and essentially the speech is about how you avoid war and defeat tyranny at the same time. But to do that, you have to be allied over certain values, and you have to demonstrate. And this is the power of the speech and the effect of the speech. You have to be willing to demonstrate your willingness to fight. And that's what Stalin reacted to, was that part. He knew this was aimed at him. So Stalin organizes an interview with Pravda in which he attacks the speech and attacks Churchill and says Churchill is like Hitler, because this is a race-based theory, this idea of the English-speaking peoples. It's a racial theory, like Hitler, says Stalin. And he attacks it bitterly. It's his most bitter attack. He'd given what's called the election speech in January, I think, in which he said the capitalism and communism are incompatible, sort of an introduction to this. And then he rages about the speech. And when Beadle Smith becomes the ambassador to the Soviet Union in early April, and there's still Russian troops, Soviet troops in Iran, he said the first thing he says to Beadle Smith, who shows up at his apartment in the Kremlin at midnight, one night he's summoned at midnight, he says, does President Truman agree with that bastard Churchill? And Beadle Smith, having gotten no instructions on this, but figures that since they were together there, that he must have agreed. He said, well, of course. And that's the sort of final moment when Stalin realizes that this alliance is real, even if it's not formal, and that Soviet troops exit Iran.
So he got the immediate result he was looking for.
Right.
Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Though, as you pointed out before, there was a lot of opposition to this, and there was no likelihood of a formal alliance for some period of time. It really it is the Marshall Plan and the creation of NATO, which takes some time to happen, that really become the formalization of all this. Which it takes the replacement of Burns, among other things, and Marshall showing up to do that.
George Marshall, the great general architect of the Allied victory in World War II, from the Pentagon, becomes Secretary of State. There's the crisis in Greece that we'll come to in a few months. When the British government informs the United States that they don't have the money anymore to maintain Greece and Turkey, and either the Soviets are going to gain power there, or the United States has got to take over that responsibility, and that produced what came to be known as the Truman Doctrine, which was arguably Harry Truman's rhetorical version of the Iron Curtain speech, Harry Truman's oratorical response, where he declares that the United States will defend freedom wherever it's threatened, and then we're off and running into a foreign policy that arguably, and we'll get to this in a little bit, persists to this day. Candice, can you, as a writer, I mean, Churchill really believed in the power of the written spoken word to alter world events, and arguably no one has vindicated that view better than he did. Where did that come from? Was that study? Was that just a theatrical bent?
Well, so he used to always joke, we think of, this great intellect, but he used to always joke that he was a horrible student, that he was last in his class. And, but one of the stories he tells, which I thought was really interesting, is that, they thought he was such a terrible student, so they wouldn't put him into into a Latin class or a Greek class. So he was just put into a regular English class. And he said that changed his life, that he learned the English language from this great teacher that he had. And he learned to use it, he learned to marshal it like an army. And it was unbelievably powerful. And as we know, he was not just the written word, but the spoken word for Churchill. And what's really interesting is that, his father also was an incredible speaker, but his father was an incredible impromptu speaker. And he was, he so admired his father, again, kind of from a distance, but he would read everything about his father, and he would take great pride when newspapers would quote his father's speeches. But Churchill himself spent hours and hours and hours preparing every speech that he gave. And, his friends used to joke that he spent the better part of his life, preparing his impromptu speeches, because everything was sort of agonizingly in great detail and effort went into every speech he gave, even though, you know, he had a speech impediment that he struggled with when he was young, and he went to get help for it. But he overcame it and finally kind of just embraced it and became, you know, not only one of really the great writers of history, but also obviously one of the great speakers of history. And that was obviously came to the fore and was hugely, hugely important and powerful during World War II. And as we see with the speech that he gave in Fulton after World War II.
He had a classic sense of balance in his sentences. He memorized, when he was at Harrow in boarding school, he memorized Macaulay's long poem, "The Lays of Ancient Rome." And when he was on the British frontier, the northwestern frontier of India, he read Macaulay and Gibbon. And you know, "The Sinews of Peace" is the actual title of the Iron Curtain speech, and that is a riff on Cicero's comment in one of his speeches, "The Sinews of War," on the sinews of war. So he had this incredible classical education, even though, as Candice says, he didn't
largely
actually
self-taught, right?
take Latin. Yeah, and he was self-taught. But it was all the English classical education. You know, it was a man of incredible words, and he admired all the other great orators in history. You could read his passage in the History of the English-Speaking Peoples about Lincoln and his magnificent oratory, and he quotes from Lincoln or Gladstone and Disraeli, or going back to Burke. He loved reading the great orators.
He on that train ride we've touched on a couple of times out to Missouri, apparently he recited from memory Longfellow's poem "Barbara Fritchie,"
Right.
one of the great Civil War poems, which ain't short. You know, he had the whole thing: "Shoot if you must this old gray head, but spare my country's flag," she said. Several of our audience have discovered or already known about the question and answer function on our call tonight, and we do have some questions. One of them I'll throw out to either or both of you. One of the great alternative history questions of the 20th century. Franklin Roosevelt had several vice presidents. Harry Truman was the last. Prior to Truman was Henry Wallace, who was replaced by Truman at the 1944 convention, with many people, realizing that FDR was not a sure bet to live out his fourth term. So an understanding that they might be picking the next president. Henry Wallace was the foremost advocate in the FDR administration for a peaceful negotiated relationship with the Soviet Union. And so the question is, take us through your alternative history of what would have happened had Henry Wallace been the vice president in April 1945 when FDR died. Can we know or surmise anything about, we can be sure he would not have responded very well to the Iron Curtain speech, but was there an alternative policy, do you think, that would have worked in this very tense, intense, important relationship between the US and the Soviet Union?
My answer would be it would have been a disaster. They'd be speaking Russian in Tehran today. But Henry Wallace was, I think this is a historical verdict about him, a very naive man. He felt that the Soviet communism was, with many faults, a progressive force in the world. And he allowed himself to be, I don't believe he was in any way, shape, or form a communist himself, but he allowed himself, when he ran for president in 1948, to be controlled by forces that themselves were controlled by or fifth columns for the Soviets, for world communism. And his naivete was so great that I think it would have been a disaster, probably not only in foreign policy with the Russians, whatever happened in China and Korea and pretty much any part of the world. I think he would have been a disaster.
Candice, we have several Churchill-related questions, and I'm going to roll them all together. Specifically, what was his speech impediment? But then, in the bringing us up to the present moment, why had he been booted out of office? And what was the mood in Britain while this was going on? We've all seen the movies where he heroically, almost single-handedly, rallies the nation and saves the West from Hitler, and then boing, immediately after he's voted out of office. What happened?
So his speech impediment was the first question.
Yes.
So he struggled with his S's, and he went to see a specialist who told him that there wasn't anything physically wrong with him. He just needed to practice and work on it. So he used to practice this sentence. It's like, the Spanish ships I cannot see because there's something about the Spanish ship, sort of over and over and over and over. And like I said, then he came to kind of accept it, and as we know, had a very, very distinctive voice that we all came to love. Yeah, I think that especially for Americans, it's very shocking and difficult to understand why Winston Churchill, who was incredibly popular, I mean, I think he had like an 83% popularity rating during the war that went up to like into the 90s at some points, why he would be then voted out of office. And I think that, so part of the reason is just understanding the difference between our system and theirs. We elect a president specifically, and they look at the different parties and the constituencies. And so for one thing, his constituency, the Conservatives, were unpopular because although he was fighting against appeasement, many people in the Conservative Party were for it, and so they were punishing the Conservatives for that. Churchill himself won his constituency, but also I think that he was an incredibly powerful and strong wartime leader, and his people were tired. They had been through hell and back, and they wanted a peacetime leader. They wanted somebody who was going to think about things like healthcare and education and all those things that you have the luxury of thinking about when you're at peace. And although they were very grateful to Churchill and still very, very proud of him, and wherever he went, people would clap for him in the streets, they felt they were tired, and they wanted somebody who would focus on peace and someone who they didn't associate with war.
And I think that's exactly right. And there's this moment when Churchill comes back from Potsdam, the returns are starting to come in. They're very, very much against him, but his advisors and he think that he still might win because the last votes that will come in are going to come in from the troops around the world, the British troops around the world. And then the real devastation for him is that the troops all voted against him. The British soldiers voted against him, and it's precisely what Candice said. They wanted to come home. They wanted to come home to peace. And there is an American analogy, which I think is George H.W. Bush, who after the Iraq War, the first Iraq War, had a 90% popularity and then was defeated by Bill Clinton because I think it wasn't wartime anymore. And we didn't want a wartime president. And they didn't want a wartime president.
Right. And when he lost, I guess Clementine, his wife, said, maybe this is a blessing in disguise. And he said, well, then it's very well disguised.
An aside, one of our audience members corrects me Barbara Fritchie was John Greenleaf Whittier, not Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And now you can all see why I washed out as an American literature graduate student years ago. This the relationship between Truman and Churchill continued, though, even after Churchill left office. He would send Truman what kind of looked like pep talk letters, little notes when he felt Truman was showing particular spine. He was Churchill was back as prime minister in time to be a supporter of Truman's war in Korea. And the question has been asked by the audience, did Truman ever reciprocate? Did he visit England either as a guest of Churchill or during Churchill's lifetime? Does anyone know that?
I don't know. Crosby?
He actually did go. He collected an honorary degree from Oxford University near the end of his presidency.
Too shabby?
He remarked that he never thought he would be a Yank at Oxford. And I'm sure that was true coming from his humble beginnings. This policy that emerged out of Fulton, out of the long telegram, out of all these events of 75 years ago, had been basically the U.S. foreign policy with little tweaks and nudges for 70 plus years through Democratic presidents, Republican presidents, conservatives, liberals, support for NATO, a commitment to the U.S. Posture in the world as a guarantor and friend of democracies and of liberty. It came into question during the past 4 years. We had a president who, for the first time, I would say, really wasn't a Truman Churchill Cold Warrior, and was highly skeptical of many aspects of the traditional Western alliance. I wonder if either of you think about what is the future? Has this partnership that in many ways was symbolized by that visit to Fulton, Missouri, has it run its course?
Well, my view, David, is that it's more important now than ever. If you look around the world, you look at the last few years, and I wouldn't put this on one particular administration, but I'd say, generally speaking, flowing over the last decade or so, we've seen the rise of China, and a China that has eliminated liberties and civil rights in Hong Kong, in Tibet, has become increasingly aggressive in Taiwan and the South China Sea. And increasingly, Xi Jinping said this past week that the East is rising and the West is falling. In Russia, we see there in Syria, we see that they've attacked American troops at one point in Syria with no response at the political level. They interfere in our elections, interfere in our social media in extraordinary ways. Iran looks like they're on the way to getting nuclear weapons. North Korea has nuclear weapons and is, they can reach Fulton now with their missiles, and pretty much anywhere in the United States. It's a pretty dangerous world out there, and we have lost a sense of alliance. The European alliances, the Asian alliances that we've had have not strengthened over this period of time. They've weakened, if anything. And I think if Churchill were alive and if Truman were alive, they would be working as hard as they could to repair those alliances, because that's what will defend us against people who do not have our best interests at heart, who are all over the world right now.
Candice, do you want to kick in on that?
I agree with what Crosby said. I think again, it's about values, and it's about you know, hopefully a global view, a world view, and there's there's always strength in alliances, and we need to be careful to respect and listen to all different kinds of points of view, but we also need to keep our friends close by.
And I think it's fair to say when we're talking about these 75th anniversaries and this sequence of events that we're going to mark over the coming years, that it wasn't all guns and tanks and bombs. It was also humanitarian aid, the Marshall Plan, which is proposed. We'll mark the proposal of the Marshall Plan next year, the passage of the Marshall Plan the year after that, which in fact, when the suggestion was made to the Truman administration that Marshall Plan aid should be offered to the Soviet Union, they did. And it was Stalin's decision to turn down that assistance from the United States in rebuilding the Soviet Union, which of course was absolutely decimated by World War II. So I love crowdsourcing the information, which we can do on Zoom in a way that we never could when we were all together. I'm told Truman, Mr. and Mrs. Truman, visited in 1956 and paid a visit on the Churchills at Chartwell. During that visit, it became a very warm and mutually admiring relationship. I read today that Truman referred to Churchill as the great figure of the 20th century, to which his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, said you'd have to go back 300 or 400 years to find his equal in the world. And Churchill famously, I think he may have been riding on, was it the presidential yacht, when he proposed a toast on a later visit to the United States to Truman and said, when I met you for the first time at Potsdam, I hated you. I loathed you for succeeding my friend, the great Franklin Roosevelt. But I have to say now, sir, I believe no person has done as much as you have to save Western civilization. So it became a rich mutual admiration society. Any closing remarks from either one of you?
I'll just say I think Churchill's view of the world and Truman's view of the world it might both be admirably summarized by what was his tagline for Churchill's history of the English-speaking peoples. On one side, there was resolution and defiance. On the other side, magnanimity and goodwill. He held both, and so did Truman. The Marshall Plan and NATO. At the end of the war, Churchill didn't want, and Truman didn't want to do what we did at the end of World War I to the Germans and to the Japanese. He wanted to restore them, not to punish them.
In fact, Churchill had done that his entire life, even when he was a very young man in the Boer War. No one fought harder than Churchill during war, and no one was faster to extend the hand of friendship after. He fought to rebuild in South Africa, and he was horrified by what the Germans went through after World War I. And he always warned, do not drive a man to desperation.
Candice, Millard, and Crosby, Kemper, thank you for this tremendous, the hour flew by. I'd go on longer, but I think an hour is a good compact to keep with our audience. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. If you want to recommend this program to your friends, it'll be posted soon, the recording of it, at the Truman Library Institute website, along with recordings of past programs that we've done over the past year. If you want to take a look, I want to echo Alex's remarks at the beginning to encourage you to take a look at our capital campaign page. Think about perhaps recognizing a loved one or thanking Harry or any other kind of message that you might want to inscribe on a brick to be placed at the newly recreated museum in Independence, Missouri. We look forward to seeing you all out there as soon as we're allowed to open the place. And again, thank you very much for a great program.
Thank you, David.
Thank
Thank you,
you,
Crosby.
David.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Night.